Okay, good morning everybody and welcome to another episode of Topical Talkology. Hi,
good morning,
Thea.
Andy.
Morning, how are you? Good?
I'm exceptionally good this morning.
Great. Okay, so listen, let's get started on this. So today we're going to talk about the different variables that makes up a person. In terms of their physical characteristics, their internal characteristics, and all these different variables and components that make us up, and how we actually operate in everyday life, and particularly in a changing landscape of the world that we are in, how adaptable we are to go with those characteristics and actually perform. So we were talking about this the other day, because our physical characteristics, let's face it, we're all different. So, in terms of height, in terms of face shape, in terms of body shape, in terms of some people have more hair, some people have different colouring, some people are a different race, all those sort of things. And those actually do have an element of how it impacts your behaviour. Because let's face it, someone who's quite tall in school will have a very different model of the world to someone who's a lot shorter, who then has to deal with the playground antics of bullying and things like that. Because let's face it, the big person's not likely going to experience that same sort of thing. So that's going to impact their psyche in a way. But then again, we've also got to look at the characteristics that people are born with that we don't see, which are what we call the intangibles. Things like depression that they may encounter, or ADHD, or other elements that we can't see externally, but unless you're actually an expert or a specialist in that area, you won't be able to identify. And we don't take that into consideration when we come to actually make our changes, because let's face it, after 52 years, or let's say 51 years, I only recently was diagnosed with ADHD in effect. Now, had I probably discovered, and I always thought it was a label, and I thought it was also, and I still think it does, because some people think because of lazy parenting that the kids have got ADHD because they're not controlling their kids or disciplining their kids properly. But there are kids who do have ADHD, but I used to think it was a label. It was the same. I used to think about if you're actually going through, if you can't handle anxiety, or you couldn't think. I used to see it as a sign of weakness. So if you actually had any sort of mental illness and things like that, I used to see it as a sign of weakness, particularly in the workplace. And I'll be the first one to say I was probably quite intolerant of that, and that people needed to man up. And so there's an element of that I still have, but I've also come to be quite flexible in terms of how I actually see people, because had I probably discovered something like ADHD 30 years ago or 35 years ago when I was studying, my ability to focus and my ability to perform and the life choices you make would have probably been very different had it been able to have been not only diagnosed, but have your parents accept that there's something wrong with your child. Because let's face it, parents don't want to be told that their kids actually have something wrong with them.
And your psychological identity, you see, that's the crucial thing. Well,
it impacts your psychological identity, because the thing is, if you can't focus at school, for example, because I didn't do well at school, I did really, really badly at school. I had to go to evening classes and do my degree and my postgraduate and things like this.
And how did that impact on you?
Well, I had to work several times harder than the average person to get there. So it made me more tenacious as a person. But the thing is, you adapt. You learn to overcome certain barriers. I mean, it's like someone who's got no hands learns to write with their feet, or they learn to paint with their feet. Things like this.
How did it affect your confidence? How did it affect your confidence?
Well, of course it affects your confidence, but I think every person's confidence is affected at some point. If someone who is
things were harder for you, and you had to be.
I'm not looking for a psychoanalysis here, Theo. So
no, the point I'm making is that you hit the nail on the head. When we should say, though, when we're talking about things like this, we're not a licensed medical entity for medical advice. You should always go and see your GP. But when I talk to parents of children who are understandably exceptionally reticent in terms of their little babies having, well, not babies, because you shouldn't really give it underneath the age of 6, their children having any medication, I tell them, look, isn't it worth finding out the reason for their behaviour? Because if there's a treatable reason, then you can alter for the positive the psychological development of your child. If you don't give them medication and they could have been helped, they will grow up under constant criticism by being told, stop it, don't do it, that's bad. And by giving them the medication, all that criticism will go away.
Well, look, there's a number of things, and it starts off very early on. I mean, the academic system, or the school system, or the educational system is the best way to describe it, is very designed. It's designed to teach people in a certain way, to teach them in a very auditory manner. And the thing is, not every child actually learns in an auditory manner. So the person who has a high level of competency in learning in an auditory manner will always flourish in a school environment, rather than someone who's far more visual or auditory digital or kinesthetic, for example, will probably have those challenges. You put on top of that some kids who probably do have something like ADHD, and I only discovered recently, after having done the research before I started taking it on an occasional basis, that actually Ritalin came out in the 1960s. It's not exactly a new drug. It's not a new phenomenon. But why is the impact of that? And I discovered it's because your body doesn't produce enough dopamine levels. Is that correct?
Under normal circumstances,
Under normal circumstances. So you almost have to have a top-up to actually reach the same baseline average as everybody else. So we've all got our flaws, we've all got our strengths, and the thing is, if life was perfect and everybody was equal, everybody would have the exact same opportunities. But those opportunities are restricted to people because of their physical characteristics, their mental characteristics, and their the internal chemical production. Because let's face it, you're going to have men who produce far more testosterone and they're a lot more alpha. You've got men who are a lot more effeminate.
Oh, that's differences.
No, we're talking about internal characteristics, because the thing is, there's got to be, isn't there, and I'll let you argue that in a minute, but do you not think that someone who produces more testosterone and someone who produces less are going to have a very different behavior?
Oh, yeah. Well, we'll talk about that in a second. But you mentioned topping up dopamine. Just in case we've got any listeners who have ADHD, what's crucial to understand about ADHD and dopamine is that there's a window of normality. So there's a window of normal level. Below that window, you've got ADHD. You don't have enough dopamine. Above that level, you've got too much dopamine. So it's as if you're a normal person who's just taken a shot of cocaine. You have to get your dose of medication that raises your dopamine right, so your dopamine lies in that normal window. And then you can, and it's interesting because some patients will think, my God, this has really helped me, I'll take a bit more. And they take a bit more, which is above the window, and they think it stopped working, so they take even more, and then they go high and agitated, and they go back to the doctor in a panic. So don't fiddle with your dose. But also I've seen even specialist units get it wrong without this concept of understanding the therapeutic window. And on top of that, there are other things that you mustn't mix with it. So anything that raises your dopamine, exercise, caffeine, which could be tea, coffee, chocolate, Coca-Cola, some of these cold remedies that contain pseudoephedrine, all those will be additive. Also, psychological states. Being in love raises your dopamine. Did you know that? If you're in an in-love state, you're in a constant dopamine-raised state, which is why especially when a girl's in love, she glows. So bear that in mind. Now, going back to individual characteristics, there are two things that are important. Your identity. Number one in everything in how we function is identity. And identity is majorly the group identity, which is what most of us depend on. And then we have our individual identity. And individual identities vary from the mass identity, which is moderate, and you get some people with a very strong identity. And those people with a very strong identity are less likely to subsume to the group identity, and guess what? Those people they have less of a need to be group members, and they are the psychopaths, and psychopaths are natural leaders.
Yeah, but hold on a second.
Which is why most CEOs are psychopaths.
Do you not think that there's going to be kids out there who want to be part of a group and they're just not accepted? So you're saying not everyone chooses to be a loner. Not everyone chooses to be a.
Well, you're right. We're naturally tribal, but the difficulty is that clearly in society has to offer you your identity, and if society doesn't offer your identity, then you are vulnerable to other less palatable members of society, other less groups of society, which is why they say he or she fell in with the wrong crowd. The reason is that the wrong crowd accepts people more easily. So, for instance, if you even look at religions, it's very hard, for instance, to be accepted into the Catholic or Orthodox Church. Did you know that?
You know, I was hoping to avoid the whole religious connotations today.
But the Muslims make it extremely easy to become Muslim.
Well, apparently there was one thing. There was a guy, and he's not my favourite, but he's this gay right-wing Trump supporter. I think he was the editor of Breitbart News as well, or something. His name was Milo Yiannopoulos, and he talks about. So I think he did some research that particularly Muslim people, when they're looking to convert people, because any religion looks for you to convert, that they target particularly redheads, male redheads, because they are normally seen as an outside of the normal group environment. Apparently,
makes absolute sense. But how interesting.
So there's an aspect of that. So you carry on.
Well, and the reason that identity is so important is, of course, because we talked about Dunbar's number, and that we're tribe and we live in groups, and the maximum number is about 150. So within that group,
hold on, let's clarify that. Dunbar's number is about 150, and this is before communication and social relationships starts to break down, and that's basically to do with because our neocortex can't seem to handle much more than that in any one individual group. Now, there is someone who did a bit of research on that. I forget his name, and he found, because he had like about 6,000 people on Facebook or something, that he bucketed them. So even though he knew 150 people in each category with some overlap, but it didn't really go over 150 to be able to actually have a social relationship with and communication before communication broke down. So 150 is the high-end number.
That's it.
Give and take.
That's it.
All right.
And therefore the survival of the group for the survival of species is paramount, and therefore people have evolved to subsume to the group identity. And of course there's all sorts of mechanisms that do that. Oxytocin, mirror neurons, they all make us function as one integral unit.
So this is something I want to bring up, actually, because you bring up an interesting point. So we talked about dopamine, and we talked about other areas, because let's face it, if you get depressed, you're likely to produce more cortisol. So there's a lot of different chemicals floating around in your body, depending on what environment you're in.
Testosterone. So yes, you're right. High levels of testosterone make you more aggressive. They effectively make you more masculine, and they've shown this repeatedly with experiments looking at antenatal exposure. That's exposure of the fetus before they're born, and they found that the higher amount of testosterone the fetus is exposed to when they are born, irrespective of their sex, the more male their behavior. And of course, typically you're going to be a male if you've got high levels of testosterone, and females don't have as high levels of testosterone.
So more feminine women will have more oxytocin, whereas more estrogen, and not oxytocin.
Oxytocin is different. The estrogen is the feminine hormone.
Yeah, but what's oxytocin? Just to clarify,
oxytocin is the bonding social hormone.
It's a bonding social hormone. Okay, but the thing is that not more prevalent in women who are straight as opposed to women who are lesbian, for example?
Don't know. That's a good question.
Okay,
excellent question.
That's because the thing is, there are some women who are more masculine, who will probably produce more oxytocin, but less oxytocin.
Less estrogen, more testosterone.
Sorry?
If they're more masculine, it's testosterone that's going to be the masculinizing hormone.
That's right, but if they're more career focused, they're likely to have less oxytocin.
Not necessarily. I think they haven't looked at that. They're more likely if they're more career focused, to be more disagreeable. Remember, and the disagreeableness is caused by testosterone.